At precisely 8:42 on the morning of November 9th, 1944, Winston Churchill sat in his study at 10 Downing Street, working through the daily newspapers, when a particular headline stopped him cold and sent his blood pressure climbing. The front page declared, "Montgomery's brilliant strategy opens Antwerp." The piece that followed lavished praise on Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his 21st Army Group, crediting them with a masterful clearing of the Scheldt estuary, an operation that would, at long last, unlock the critical port of Antwerp for Allied supply lines. Montgomery was quoted generously throughout, with the article celebrating his careful planning and decisive leadership. British forces received prominent billing. What the article failed to mention, not in a single line across all 15 paragraphs, was that the fighting had been carried out almost exclusively by Canadian troops, that more than 6,000 Canadians had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in some of the war's most savage combat, and that it was Canadian generals who had conceived and directed the tactics that delivered victory. Churchill set the newspaper down with exaggerated delicacy, the kind of slow, controlled movement his staff had come to recognize as a warning sign that he was quietly furious. He summoned his private secretary, and the moment the young man stepped into the room, Churchill jabbed a finger at the article. "Bring me the actual operational reports from the Scheldt campaign," he said, his voice low and even. "I want to know precisely which forces did the fighting and which commanders were responsible for the planning. Then arrange a telephone connection to Field Marshal Montgomery. I intend to speak with him this afternoon." The Scheldt campaign had been among the most consequential operations of the autumn of 1944. Following the liberation of Paris and the swift Allied sweep across France and Belgium, Allied forces had seized the enormous port of Antwerp virtually undamaged in early September, a remarkable feat that should have gone a long way toward solving the alliance's worsening supply crisis. The problem was that Germany still held the Scheldt estuary, the stretch of water connecting the North Sea to Antwerp, which rendered the port completely useless despite being in Allied possession. As long as German forces controlled both banks of the estuary and the heavily fortified islands in between, no ship could reach Antwerp. Clearing the Scheldt became the single most pressing objective for autumn operations, the linchpin of keeping the Allied advance moving and preventing the entire logistical system from breaking down. As commander of the 21st Army Group, which comprised British, Canadian, and Polish forces, Montgomery carried responsibility for making it happen. Yet Montgomery had initially dragged his feet, far more interested in pushing toward the Ruhr and pursuing his ill-fated Operation Market Garden. It took direct pressure from Eisenhower, essentially an order, before Montgomery gave the Scheldt the attention it required, and when he finally allocated forces to the task, he handed the operation almost entirely to the 1st Canadian Army under General James Carleton, with the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division absorbing the hardest fighting. What followed was a grinding nightmare. The Scheldt estuary presented a landscape of waterlogged polders, fortified islands, and dug-in German defenders who understood perfectly well that surrendering the estuary meant surrendering Antwerp and accelerating Germany's collapse. Canadian soldiers waded through waist-deep floodwater, hurled themselves at heavily reinforced positions with almost no cover, and fought through fortified towns, building by building in vicious close-quarters combat. The Germans held on with the ferocity of men who knew they were running out of time and out of options. The battle stretched from early October into early November, and the toll on the Canadians was staggering. Over 6,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, with some battalions cut down to half their original strength. It ranked among the bloodiest fighting Canadians had endured since the Normandy landings. But they had done it. By early November, the last German holdouts had been rooted out. The estuary was clear, and minesweepers were already working through the channel, so ships could finally make port at Antwerp. This was an unambiguous Canadian victory, bought with Canadian lives and won through Canadian skill. The commanders who drew up the plans were Canadian. The soldiers who carried them out were Canadian. The casualties were overwhelmingly Canadian. And now Montgomery was positioning himself in the British press as the author of that victory, framing it as his strategy and his triumph, reducing the men who had actually bled for it to afterthoughts. When he acknowledged them at all, Churchill's secretary returned within 2 hours, carrying the operational reports. Churchill worked through them page by page, his anger building steadily. The documents confirmed everything he had already suspected. Canadian units had led every major assault. Canadian commanders had worked out the tactics for fighting across flooded ground. Canadian engineers had cracked the technical challenges of attacking fortified positions across water. British participation had been limited, mostly artillery support and some operations on the flanks. A Canadian victory was being sold to the British public as a British achievement, and Churchill regarded that as both a moral failure and a serious political miscalculation. It was the political dimension that gnawed at him most. Canada had been in the fight since September 1939, had put more than 1 million men and women in uniform from a country of only 11 million people, had absorbed tens of thousands of casualties, and had shouldered enormous financial burdens. Canadian public sentiment was growing increasingly raw on the question of whether Britain and the other allies were giving Canada the recognition it had earned. Prime Minister Mackenzie King faced relentless pressure from political opponents who insisted that Canada was being treated as a subordinate rather than an equal partner, that Canadian soldiers were being fed into the worst fighting, while British commanders walked away with the medals and the headlines. Churchill knew this terrain well because he had been navigating it carefully for years. He made a point of publicly praising Canadian contributions in his speeches. He saw to it that Canadian achievements were called out in official communications. He kept his relationship with Mackenzie King deliberately close, fully aware that continued Canadian commitment to the war depended on Canadians believing their sacrifices actually mattered to their allies. And now Montgomery had unraveled much of that patient work in a single interview, claiming ownership of a Canadian victory and reducing Canada's role to that of a supporting player in a British show. The line to Montgomery's headquarters was connected at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Churchill lifted the receiver and skipped the pleasantries entirely. "Field Marshal, I have spent this morning reading the newspapers with a mixture of fascination and alarm. There is a substantial article about the Scheldt operation that quotes you extensively and leaves readers with the clear impression that this was principally a British success achieved under your inspired direction. I have also spent time with the actual operational reports, which paint a considerably different picture? Perhaps you'd like to account for that gap." Montgomery's voice came back steady and unbothered, as though he saw nothing particularly troubling in Churchill's tone. "Prime Minister, the press tends to reduce complex matters to simple ones. The Canadians obviously contributed significantly to the operation, but as overall commander of the 21st Army Group, the strategic planning and coordination fell to me. I assume that's what the article had in mind." Churchill's hand tightened around the receiver. "Field Marshal, let me lay out precisely what those operational reports contain. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division executed the assault on the Breskins Pocket. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division cleared South Beveland. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division supported operations across both flanks. Canadian engineers resolved the technical difficulties of attacking across flooded terrain. Canadian artillery provided the majority of fire support. Canadian casualties ran past 6,000 men. British involvement was marginal by any honest comparison. This was not a case of the Canadians contributing significantly. This was a Canadian operation, conceived and carried out by Canadians, from beginning to end. A silence settled on the line. When Montgomery spoke again, something in his tone had shifted. A note of defensiveness had crept in. The overall command architecture and strategic framework originated at my headquarters. The Canadians performed excellently in executing the plan, but that plan reflected my operational vision for clearing the estuary. Churchill had anticipated exactly this line of argument and had his answer prepared. "I have the planning documents in front of me, Field Marshal. They show that General Aldridge and General Carleton developed the specific tactical approaches for each assault. Your headquarters set the general objectives and the schedule. The actual solutions, the methods for achieving those objectives against that terrain and those defenses, were worked out by Canadian commanders who understood the ground far better than your British staff officers ever could. You handed the Canadians a mission and left them to figure out how to accomplish it. That is called delegation. It is not strategic brilliance." Montgomery pushed back. "Prime Minister, with respect, as Army Group Commander, I bear responsibility for every operation conducted by forces under my command. When those operations succeed, credit naturally moves up through the chain of command. That's simply how military structures work." Churchill cut him off cleanly. "Field Marshal, I am perfectly familiar with how military structures work. I am equally familiar with how political realities work, and on that subject you appear to be dangerously uninformed. Do you have any grasp of what is actually happening in Canada at this moment? Do you understand that Mackenzie King is fighting to hold Canadian support for the war together against an opposition that is telling Canadians they are being exploited by Britain? Do you appreciate that an article like the one I read this morning hands those critics exactly the ammunition they need, a Canadian victory being claimed by a British general as proof that Canada is not treated as a sovereign ally?" The pause, this time, ran longer. Montgomery's reply, when it came, sounded slightly deflated. "I wasn't aware of the political situation in Canada. My attention has been on running military operations, not managing press relations." Churchill's voice dropped to something his secretary, listening from the far side of the room, would later describe simply as glacial. "Then allow me to bring you up to speed, Field Marshal. Canada is not a possession of Britain. It is an independent dominion that made its own sovereign choice to enter this war. Canadian troops serve under your command because the Canadian government agreed to integrate their forces into British command structures, not because you hold any natural authority over them. That arrangement rests entirely on Canadian confidence that their soldiers will be well led and their accomplishments properly acknowledged. When you take credit for victories paid for in Canadian blood, you erode that confidence and you risk fracturing an alliance that we cannot afford to lose. Montgomery attempted to interject, but Churchill pressed on without pause. Let me be entirely clear about what happens next. You will reach out to the British press today and issue a correction. You will state explicitly that the Scheldt operation was planned and executed by Canadian forces under Canadian command. You will name General Carleton and General Aldridge by name. You will describe the Canadian casualties and the Canadian tactical innovations that made the operation possible. You will leave no room for ambiguity. This was a Canadian victory, and your role was one of coordination, not operational command. Is that understood? The line went quiet. Then Montgomery spoke. The confidence of earlier in the conversation now gone. Prime Minister, putting out such a correction will make it look as though I was attempting to take credit that belonged to the Canadians. It will be personally embarrassing and could do real damage to my standing. Churchill's response came without a moment's hesitation. Yes, it will be embarrassing. You have brought that on yourself through your own actions. Your reputation will endure because you have genuine accomplishments to stand on. Accomplishments that don't require you to absorb the credit for what other men achieved. But if you fail to issue this correction today, I will issue it myself. A statement will go out from 10 Downing Street, setting the record straight, and I will ensure that everyone understands the Prime Minister was compelled to intervene personally because you refused to give Allied forces the recognition they were owed. I'll leave it to you to decide which outcome you prefer. Another beat of silence. Then Montgomery, his voice quiet and drained. I'll put out the clarification today. Good, Churchill said. And Field Marshal, let me offer you some guidance going forward. The Canadian forces serving under your command are not British soldiers who happen to carry Canadian identity cards. They are sovereign forces contributed freely by an independent nation. They are entitled to the same respect and the same recognition you would extend to American forces or the Free French. When they win victories, those victories belong to Canada, not to Britain, and most certainly not to you. If you find yourself unable to accept that, then we may need to revisit whether you are the right commander for an army group that includes a substantial Canadian contingent. The implied threat could not have been clearer. Churchill was putting Montgomery on notice that his command itself could be reconsidered if he continued to treat Canadian contributions with contempt. For a man whose entire sense of himself was tied to his position as Britain's foremost field commander, that was a warning that landed hard. "I understand, Prime Minister," Montgomery said. "It won't happen again." Churchill replaced the receiver and leaned back, still simmering, but satisfied that the message had been delivered with enough force to produce results. He then dictated a cable to Mackenzie King, letting the Canadian Prime Minister know that the press coverage issue had been addressed, that Montgomery had been instructed to issue a proper acknowledgement of Canadian achievements, and that Churchill personally wished to convey Britain's deep gratitude for the sacrifices Canadian forces had made in the Scheldt campaign. The cable went out within the hour. Montgomery's statement appeared in the British press the next day. It was terse and unmistakably written under compulsion, but it delivered what Churchill had required. Montgomery acknowledged that the Scheldt operation had been carried out primarily by the 1st Canadian Army, that Generals Carleton and Aldridge had developed the tactical plans, that Canadian troops had shouldered the bulk of the fighting and the losses, and that their achievement under extraordinarily difficult conditions was a tribute to Canadian arms. The statement was not warm and it was not gracious, but it was accurate, and it corrected what had been put on the record. The Canadian press picked up the clarification immediately and gave it prominent play, observing that Churchill had evidently stepped in to ensure Canadian contributions were properly credited. Mackenzie King released a statement expressing gratitude to Churchill and saluting Canadian troops for their outstanding performance in one of the most demanding campaigns the war had produced. The political crisis that had been gathering momentum was, at least for the moment, deflated. But the episode had exposed fault lines that would not go away. Montgomery never genuinely came to terms with the idea that Canadian forces were independent allies rather than extensions of British military power. He went on seeing himself as the rightful author of every success achieved by any formation under his command, regardless of who had actually done the planning and the dying. His relationships with Canadian commanders stayed tense throughout. Both Carleton and Aldridge would later report that Montgomery dealt with them condescendingly and appeared chronically irritated by the obligation to work alongside officers he considered his inferiors. Churchill, meanwhile, found himself returning again and again to the same task, making sure Canadian contributions were not quietly buried. He flagged Canadian achievements in his speeches to Parliament. He pushed to see that Canadian commanders were properly decorated. He kept up steady contact with Mackenzie King, tending the political relationship that held Canada's commitment to the war in place. It was wearing work that demanded time and energy he could ill afford to spend, but he recognized it as indispensable. The Canadian alliance was too valuable to be sacrificed on the altar of British self-congratulation or Montgomery's personal vanity. The broader tendency to downplay Canadian contributions, or to fold them into British achievements, ran through the war years and carried well into the post-war decades. When historians sat down to write the definitive accounts, British and American forces dominated the story, with Canadian actions typically reduced to footnotes or passing references. The Scheldt campaign, for all its strategic weight in the autumn of 1944, attracted far less attention than Market Garden, Montgomery's preceding disaster. The Canadian role in liberating the Netherlands, which forged ties between Canada and the Dutch people that endure to this day, was routinely described as a peripheral element of broader British operations rather than as a distinct and defining Canadian achievement. Some of this came down to scale. Canada was simply smaller than Britain or the United States, which meant fewer soldiers in the field, which in turn meant less space in histories that naturally gravitated toward the largest forces and the most dramatic engagements. Some of it came down to the machinery of information. Both the British and American governments ran sophisticated propaganda operations that actively shaped how the war was presented at home and abroad. Canada's efforts in that arena were considerably more modest, which meant Canadian achievements never received the same sustained promotion, and some of it came down to commanders like Montgomery, who appeared to hold a genuine belief that any victories secured by forces under his authority belonged, in some essential sense, to him, regardless of who had actually fought and bled for it. This attitude carried a particular sting when directed at Canadian forces. Canada had not entered this war because it was under direct threat. Canadians had crossed an ocean voluntarily to fight for values and for allies, and they had every reasonable expectation that the cost of that decision would be honestly acknowledged rather than quietly absorbed into someone else's reputation. Churchill grasped this and pushed back against the current repeatedly, but he was working against deep institutional habits. The British military had spent centuries treating Dominion forces as extensions of imperial power rather than as the armies of independent nations. Many British officers had spent careers commanding colonial troops in India or elsewhere in the empire, and those assumptions traveled with them when they dealt with Canadians. The notion that Canadian soldiers deserved equal credit and equal respect was something many British commanders accepted in the abstract while resisting in practice, shaped as they were by a system built on the presumption of British preeminence. The episode over the Scheldt credit took root in Canadian military memory, though the details shifted with each retelling. Veterans passed down stories of how Churchill had gone to bat for Canadian honor against Montgomery's brazen attempt to appropriate their victory, how the Prime Minister himself had forced a reluctant field marshal to stand up and acknowledge what Canada had done. The story became a source of pride, a piece of evidence that at least one voice in British leadership had genuinely understood what Canadians had accomplished and had been willing to fight for them to receive proper credit. But the same story also threw into sharp relief the structural problem at the heart of coalition warfare. When forces from several nations serve under commanders drawn from the dominant power, the smaller partners are perpetually vulnerable to having their contributions absorbed into someone else's narrative. The Canadians were capable enough to be assigned the worst missions, the ones that required exceptional resolve and promised heavy casualties. The Scheldt was a textbook case, a brutal, grinding operation that Montgomery handed to the Canadians because he was confident they could get it done, whatever the conditions and whatever the cost. But when they succeeded, the credit drifted upward to a British general rather than staying with the people who had earned it. That pattern bred a resentment that outlasted the war by decades. Canadian veterans came home feeling that their victories had been quietly taken from them, that they had fought and bled for achievements that the history books credited to British generals. Young Canadians who learned about the war in school encountered accounts that cast Canada as a junior participant assisting Britain rather than as a sovereign nation that had chosen at enormous cost to stand with its allies. That sense of being written out of the story fed the wave of Canadian nationalism that rose through the post-war years, a determination to assert independence and push back against the remnants of imperial thinking. Churchill's intervention in the Scheldt credit dispute was one episode in a long, ongoing effort to keep those competing pressures in balance. He was genuine in his appreciation for what Canada had contributed, and he understood that Canadian support could not be assumed or taken for granted. But he also had to manage a British public that wanted to see its own forces and its own commanders at the center of the victory narrative. Holding those two realities together demanded constant work and, occasionally, the kind of blunt intervention he had delivered to Montgomery over the telephone. The irony is that Montgomery's attempt to claim the Scheldt ultimately cost him more than it gained him. Historians who studied the campaign in detail recognized that the fighting had been done by Canadians, and that Montgomery's actual contribution had amounted to assigning the task and supplying the resources. When his memoirs appeared after the war, they continued to minimize what Canada had done, which prompted Canadian historians to go back through the records and document the full extent of Canadian involvement. Those studies made explicit what Montgomery had tried to obscure, and the result damaged his legacy, turning him into a figure of lasting resentment in Canada. The men who had actually fought in the Scheldt never needed a historian to tell them what had happened. They had waded through freezing floodwater while machine gun fire cut down the men beside them. They had cleared bunkers and pillboxes one at a time, face to face, in brutal close combat. They had absorbed artillery barrages and counterattacks, and the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting without pause. They knew with absolute certainty who had won that battle. It was not Montgomery and his headquarters drafting orders. It was the Canadian infantryman who had gone into the Breskin's pocket. It was the Canadian tanker who had pushed through South Beveland. It was the Canadian engineer who had thrown a bridge across flooded ground while enemy fire came in. Those men owned that victory in a way no general could claim, and the attempt to strip it from them left a wound that did not easily heal. When veterans made their way home to Canada after the war, a great many of them carried that bitterness with them. They had watched British and American commanders step forward to accept credit for what Canadians had accomplished. They had read dispatches and newspaper stories that either ignored Canadian forces entirely or nudged them into the background as supporting players in someone else's drama, when the truth was often the opposite. That accumulated grievance shaped how Canadians looked at Britain in the post-war years, feeding the country's gradual movement away from close imperial ties and toward a foreign policy grounded in genuine independence. When Churchill died in 1965, Canadians reflected on what his relationship with Canada and the Commonwealth had actually meant. Newspaper columnists noted that for all his instincts as an imperialist, Churchill had shown a consistent and meaningful respect for Canadian sovereignty and Canadian contributions throughout the war. The Scheldt episode surfaced in several obituaries as a concrete example of Churchill defending Canada against the arrogance of the British military establishment. For many Canadians, that single act carried more weight than any of his great speeches or grand strategic calculations. It was evidence that he had seen Canada clearly, not as a colonial asset to be used and set aside, but as an independent ally that had earned genuine respect. Montgomery lived until 1976 and went to his grave without ever truly reckoning with the damage his attitude toward Canadian forces had done to how he is remembered. In interviews in his later years, he continued to present himself as the architect of every victory achieved under his command, consistently diminishing the role of subordinate commanders of whatever nationality. That stubborn refusal to acknowledge what others had done became one of the defining marks of his legacy, a character flaw that serious historians placed alongside his genuine operational talents whenever they assessed the man. The Scheldt campaign itself gradually gained the recognition it deserved, largely through the efforts of Canadian historians who were determined to recover the story and tell it honestly. Books and documentary films laid out the brutal fighting in detail, the tactical ingenuity, the punishing casualties, the strategic importance of opening Antwerp. The campaign became a standard case study in Canadian military education, held up as a model of successful operations under the most difficult imaginable conditions. Veterans organizations took it upon themselves to make sure the story reached younger generations, resolved that Canadian achievements would not be buried under narratives written from British or American vantage points. The deeper lesson running through the whole Scheldt credit dispute is about power, about narrative, and about what it costs smaller nations to fight alongside larger ones. Whoever shapes the story shapes how history records what happened. Britain and America commanded larger propaganda machines, more prominent historians, and far greater reach in international public discourse. That gave them the power to frame the war on their own terms, in ways that routinely pushed smaller allies like Canada to the margins. Resisting that required constant vigilance and sustained advocacy, work that Canadian political and military leaders eventually learned to do, but that should never have been necessary in the first place. Churchill's decision to intervene on Canada's behalf mattered not just for its immediate effect, but for what it demonstrated. It showed that a leader could choose to ensure that all contributors to a victory received honest recognition, rather than allowing credit to be monopolized by individual commanders or dominant nations. It showed that political authority could and should override military ego when the integrity of the alliance was at stake, and it gave official legitimacy to Canadian grievances that might otherwise have been dismissed as the thin-skinned complaints of a junior partner. The story of what Churchill said and did when Montgomery claimed the Scheldt as his own is, at its core, a story about respect, about what coalitions require to hold together and what happens when the people in charge forget that. It makes clear that winning wars depends not only on tactical skill and material power, but on managing the human and political dimensions of fighting alongside others. It shows that effective leadership means being honest about who did what and why. And it is a reminder that every victory is built on the bodies of real soldiers, and those soldiers and the nations that sent them are owed the truth about what they gave. Churchill understood that. Montgomery did not. That gap in understanding is precisely why one man is remembered in Canada with gratitude and the other with contempt. One as someone who defended Canadian honor when it was under threat, and the other as a symbol of exactly the kind of imperial arrogance that Canadians crossed an ocean to help defeat.